Ladies and gentlemen, the first of our speakers is well known, I suspect, to all of you, Corelli Barnett. He is of, I think I could say, of an age to have done national service after the Second World War, when he served in the intelligence corps in Palestine as a sergeant. And many of you, I think, will know that Geoffrey Elton, that doyen of historians, described that as the best rank of all. And given how many naval and army officers we have here, I suspect they would all disagree with that. Then, of course, he was at Exeter College, Oxford, before in 1960 publishing his first, and some would say his most famous and iconoclastic book, The Desert Generals, which still stands up today to modern research. This resulted in his working for 18 months on the BBC series The Great War, forming a formidable partnership with John Terraine to ensure that a proper historical view was taken of that war. And after that, he gradually turned to look at the combination of tradition and technological inferiority in Britain and her military-industrial complex. And that bore fruit in a 4-volume series entitled overall The Pride and the Fall, published between 1972 and 2001. But I hasten to add, it's been newly reissued by Faber and Faber. And that thesis influenced many politicians, particularly in the Conservative Party. He was keeper of the Churchill Archive Centre here from 77 to 95. And as a result of the Naval Archives there, he wrote Engage the Enemy More Closely, almost certainly the best single-volume history of the Royal Navy in the Second World War. He's still writing, and has recently published The Lords of War 2 years ago. And that volume, those of you who've read it will know, contains only one sailor in it, and that is the subject of today's symposium, Bertrand Ramsay. And his talk today is entitled The Role of Dunkirk in Shaping Ramsay's Wartime Leadership and Reputation.
Thank you. Colleagues, in the true spirit of Bertrand Ramsay, and indeed Horatio Nelson, I may not strictly obey the signals from Alan Packwood, our academic flag officer today. I may even sometimes steer across the bows of other speakers, because we are here to study Admiral Sir Bertrand Ramsay in the round, both as a leader and as a man. I will start with a quotation from Ramsay himself, which seems to me perfectly to encapsulate his professional approach. This is what he said. Because it all went so smoothly, it may seem to some people that it was all easy and plain sailing. Nothing could be more wrong. It was excellent planning and execution. In these simple words, written in pencil in his pocket diary 6 weeks after D-Day, did the Naval Commander Allied Expeditionary Force, ANCXF, sum up Operation Neptune, the remarkable feat of transporting the Allied armies and all their weapons and equipment from England to the Normandy shore on D-Day and after. In my judgment, military historians of D-Day and the Normandy campaign too often neglect Neptune and concentrate on the conduct of the land battle once the invasion armies reached the beaches. Yet in fact, to get those armies onto those beaches entailed, and I quote Ramsay's own words at the time, probably the largest and most complicated operation ever undertaken, and involves the movement of over 4,000 ships and craft of all types in the first 3 days. As Ramsay well knew, Operation Neptune would be the greatest of gambles, because on this one card, the invasion, America and Britain were staking the whole outcome of the war. So this was the one and unrepeatable opportunity to re-establish the Western Front, defeat the German army in battle, and open the way for an eventual invasion of the Third Reich. So not even Nelson had carried such a weight of responsibility as the Naval Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, Admiral Sir Bertrand Ramsay. Now I go. A Scot whose family had moved from the Highlands to the Lowlands, Ramsay combined stubborn advocacy of what he believed to be professionally right with an outgoing personality that did much to soothe the ruffled relationships within the Allied Supreme Command in 1944. Professionally, he was a very modern type of admiral, formerly on the directing staffs of the Naval Staff College and the Imperial Defence College, and a keen believer in the staff system. In 1935, he actually resigned from the Royal Navy because as Chief of Staff Home Fleet, he had clashed with the then C&C, Admiral Sir Roger Backhouse, an old-fashioned officer who believed that the C&C should decide everything himself, down to the smallest detail. But while on the retired list, Ramsay was asked to report on the condition of Dover as an operational out-defended port. And this paved the way for his appointment on the outbreak of war as Flag Officer Dover Command in the rank of Vice Admiral and reporting direct to the Admiralty. In May 1940, it fell to him as Flag Officer to organise at a week's notice the evacuation of as many as possible of the 400,000 soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force and the First French Army, now trapped around Dunkirk against the sea by elements of two German army groups. Since his headquarters were located in the old Great War electric dynamo room inside the White Cliffs of Dover, the forthcoming operation was codenamed Dynamo. It perfectly summed up the hectic pace, the driving energy of the evacuation now directed by Ramsay. He and his tri-service staff had to organise, schedule, and route and reroute the traffic between British ports and Dunkirk of a motley armada of vessels ranging from destroyers and cross-channel steamers down to river motorboats and cutter-rigged cockle boats. This traffic was exposed to constant attack by Stuka dive bombers and machine gunning and cannon fire from Messerschmitt 109 fighters, as were then, of course, the wide Dunkirk beaches and the two lattice-work wooden moles that alone enabled passenger ferries to load troops. Ramsay gave an inkling of his own state of mind in a letter to his wife as the evacuation got underway, and I'll quote it. "I have on at the moment, it's 1 a.m., one of the most difficult and hazardous operations ever conceived, and unless le bon Dieu is very kind, there will be certain to be many tragedies attached to it. I hardly dare to think about it, and what the day is going to bring with it. How I would love to cast off the mantle of responsibility which is mine and just become peaceful and retired once again. All my staff are completely worn out, and yet I see no prospect at all of any let-up. As for my ships, they have not a moment's rest unless they are damaged badly." It had originally been hoped that at best some 45,000 soldiers could be rescued. But when Dynamo came to an end on 4 June, the total brought safely home had reached 338,000. In Ramsay's words in a letter to his wife, "The relief is stupendous, the results beyond belief." And he had no doubts as to why the operation had proved so successful, telling her, without false modesty, and I quote, that we can always count on the glorious deeds, but less often on good direction and management. My staff was so well chosen and so efficient that they worked like a perfect machine. Dynamo proved Ramsay's cool nerve in a crisis, his steadiness of judgment, and his ability to mastermind a complex amphibious operation, even in the worst of circumstances. In August 1942, he was appointed deputy to Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham in organising Operation Torch, the forthcoming invasion of Vichy French North Africa. Cunningham, a great fighting admiral, was very content to leave it to Ramsay to work with General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, in this, the inaugural Anglo-American Joint Command Structure. For the first time in history, a naval expedition was organized and planned with the thoroughness that had long characterized grand offensives on land. And in contrast to the disasters at Gallipoli in 1915, the Allied landings in French North Africa in 1942 climaxed in May 1943 with the surrender of 230,000 trapped Axis troops. In the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, Ramsay commanded the Eastern Task Force. As he wrote to his wife, "It was a treat to be at sea, quote, with my flag flying." In October that year came the biggest possible professional challenge, appointment as Allied Naval Commander Expeditionary Force in Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy scheduled for summer 1944. Churchill himself strongly backed his appointment on the score, and I quote Churchill, "not only of Ramsay's natural abilities, but his unique experience in conducting a great overseas descent." On duly taking up his command in October 1943, Ramsay was clear in his mind that success must depend on close cooperation between himself and General Sir Bernard Montgomery, Ground Force Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force. Yet, as Ramsay well knew, Monty's egotism made him a difficult colleague. For this reason, Ramsay even moved into the same block of flats as Monty in the spring of 1944. Quote, "He's not the ideal messmate, Monty," confided Ramsay to his wife, "as he apparently must always lead the stage, which gets a bit boring. But he's almost always interesting. He and I get on well together, and he listens to my advice and generally acts on it." In fact, Ramsay was to have a bigger problem in his relations with his naval subordinate commanders, both British and American. He found Rear Admiral Kirk, the American commander designate of the Western Task Force, a pompous and whinging fusspot. And at the beginning of May 1944, he characterized 2 letters from Kirk about the threat from German E-boats as, quote, "hysterical," unquote. "He has quite lost his sense of proportion, besides being rather offensively rude. My opinion of him decreases steadily. He is not a big enough man to hold the position he does." Rear Admiral Vian, British commander designate of the Eastern Task Force, a man of dark and difficult nature, added to Ramsay's stresses. At a meeting in March, Vian struck him, quote, "as being a little helpless and requires to be given so much guidance on matters which I feel he could work out for himself." Right from the start of taking up his command, Ramsay had been absolutely clear as to the fundamental principle that must inspire planning for Neptune. And I quote, "It is the responsibility of the Navy to land the army as they require." He followed on from that, and I quote again, "A sound military plan subsequent to the amphibious assaults must be the basis of the whole operational plan." Well, the existing plan inherited by Ramsay, Monty, and Dwight Eisenhower as the Supreme Commander was for an initial assault, you've heard this already, but 3 divisions on a 30-mile front along the Bay of the Seine in Normandy. This was a sandy shore with good access inland, relatively easy reach, with Cherbourg not too far off. However, Monty, with Eisenhower's endorsement, decided that in order to win a secure lodgment on D-Day, the width of the invasion front must be increased from 30 miles to 50. Well, that entailed increasing the assault forces from 3 divisions to 5, with 2 in reserve for the immediate follow-up. But that, of course, in turn, demanded a major enlargement of the shipping lift and the escorting naval forces. So here was Ramsay's first great headache, and a major test of his principle that it was the Navy's job to land the army as it required. For the Allies simply did not possess in the European theatre enough landing craft to put 5 divisions ashore in Normandy and also carry out a simultaneous landing in the south of France, Operation Anvil, to which the Americans had set their mind on. Only after what Ramsay called, and I quote, a cross-Atlantic game of ball between Washington and London did the American Chiefs of Staff finally agree that the Anvil must be postponed in order to release craft for Neptune Overlord. On 10 April 1944, Operation Neptune Naval Orders at last went to print. They were the consummation of 3 months of meticulously thorough staff work under Ramsay's direction, and they ran to 579 pages, plus numerous appendices. The orders defined the task of the Allied navies on D-Day as, and I quote, the safe and timely arrival of the assault forces at their beaches, the cover of their landings, and subsequently the support and maintenance and rapid build-up of our forces ashore. The orders lay down in detail, complete with diagrams and timetables, the interlocking movements of this mass of some 6,000 vessels of every shape, size, and speed, so they would arrive off the Normandy shore in correct sequence on D-Day and after. Taken all in all, Operation Neptune naval orders have never been surpassed in their scope and thoroughness, and in the scale and the complexity of the problems solved. And it all worked on the day. So all credit to that very modern Admiral, Bertram Ramsay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. That's marvellous. Now, our second speaker is a younger version of our other 2 speakers, but his military service has been in the Royal Naval Reserve, where he held the rank, maybe he still holds the rank, I don't know, Andrew, of Lieutenant Commander. Retired. He read international politics for his first degree at Aberystwyth, and then studied for a PhD in the War Studies Department at King's London, where he studied Admiralty procurement policies in the 1930s, and no doubt read much of what Corelli Barnett had written. And in 1996, he produced his best-known work, The Rules of the Game, a study both of Jutland and, more critically, of the Royal Navy's command system. And it was greeted, I can say, rapturously, winning numerous awards. Since then, he's been a regular lecturer to the Royal Navy at the Maritime Warfare Centre at HMS Dryad, as well as being visiting lecturer to both the Royal Australian and American Navies. At present, he is a senior maritime lecturer at the Joint Services Command and Staff College, and is due to publish, as I think we all know, a much anticipated biography of Bertram Ramsay. His first offering to us today is entitled New Insights into Ramsay's Role at Dunkirk. Andrew.
Is it?
That's what I've got written down. Ramsay, Dover and Dunkirk. I've got written down.
First World War.
In the first,
Yes,
I beg your
yes.
pardon.
Yes. Surprises like that aren't welcome. Lieutenant Commander Bertram Ramsay arrived in Dover in October 1915 and took command of his first ship. It was the M25. It was a small monitor. He'd been given the job or recommended for it by the Vice Admiral Dover Patrol, Reginald Bacon, who had been his captain in Dreadnought back in 1906-7. This was his first command. The M25 it looks big in this picture. Actually, it was really very small. It was about 500 tons. And it's slightly difficult to work out exactly what these ships were for. They were ordered in haste when Germany occupied the coast of Belgium in 1914, and they were very rudimentary. There is one in Portsmouth, a half-sister of Ramsay's ship, not quite the same, different armament, but the same size, and may now be, for all I know, open to the public. I'm not sure. But if you ask nicely, you can get to go around it. Ramsay settled into Dover in this slightly strange gunboat, and he spent a lot of time patrolling, occasionally bombarding the Belgian coast with these enormous 7.5-inch gun, which is quite huge for a ship that size. Some of them had 9.2s, but they were changed. He got a reputation as a very efficient officer. He was very much a rule book man. The Navy would have called him very pusser. He was a disciplinarian, and he was very keen on spit and polish and paint. And he had a secret paint formula given by a friend of his, James Morton, in the Mediterranean. I've been trying to work out what it is. I think it contains zinc. But anyway, this secret formula enabled his ship to glow in ways that their peers could not do. And it was a source of great envy, and lots of people tried to find out what the formula was. It is quite difficult. This is a group of COs with Reginald Bacon with the walking stick. Ramsay's on the extreme left. On the extreme right is quite interesting. That's the Flag Lieutenant Morgan, Vaughan Morgan, who would be Ramsay's chief of staff for the rank of captain in 1940 at the time of Dunkirk. Now, where did Ramsay go? Well, the Dover Patrol was a kind of modern Classis Britannica, sort of 1600 years on. And instead of being based in Dover and Boulogne, it was based in Dover and Dunkirk, which is very close behind the Western Front, supporting the British Army. Now, Ramsay became very familiar. He spent a lot of time based in Dunkirk, at anchor in Dunkirk roads or in the harbour, and a lot of time going along these beaches, which of course became famous in 1940. He would often go out in support of destroyers. They worked out a role for these peculiar craft, that they would act as a kind of backstop if destroyers were jumped by Germans, because their big gun was considered to be a deterrent. And he spent quite a few nights at anchor in a little anchorage called the Potje. This is Dutch. I don't really know how to pronounce it, but it means potty in Dutch. And there's a little fair weather anchorage inside the sandbanks between Bray Dune and La Panne. And there M25 spent some time at anchor. It was there that Lord Gort would embark in the minesweeper Hebe during the Dunkirk evacuation in 1940. But the point is, perhaps, that Ramsay spent many, many months, 2 years, in this strange little ship, becoming extremely familiar with this coast, with the buoy system, with the terrible tides. If you read the tide tables and the Admiralty pilots, it's a nightmare. The sandbanks extend 16 miles to seawards. The change of tides can vary by 2.5 hours according to the weather, entirely unpredictable, and they can go up to 2.5 or 3 knots. So very, very difficult navigation and very shallow and a constant risk of running aground. He became completely familiar with Dunkirk and with this coast. In 1940, he did not need to go and have a look because he knew it as well as anybody did. Now, there was an operation in 1917, that was planned but never executed, so it's not known much, and that was Operation Hush. Operation Hush was an extraordinary plan by Reginald Bacon and Rawlinson and Field Marshal Haig to land a division just behind enemy lines, just kind of a little bit east of Newport, between West End and Middlekirk, tiny places on the coast. And the idea was to land a division with tanks, which is quite incredible since they'd only a few months ago been first used in battle, land them on the shore and get behind the Germans and attack Ostend from behind. It had to be dependent on linking up with the British Army advance from Ypres, so you can kind of see the flaw in the plan already. Of the technical challenges which the Dover Patrol grappled with was how to get a division ashore. And so Bacon, this was Bacon's absolute element, because this is what he did. He built 3 enormous pontoons, 550 feet long, which would be pushed with monitors, larger monitors than Ramsay's, strapped alongside either side, and pushed up into the beach, whereupon the men and the tanks could debunk onto the beach. A lot of practice was done with this in the remoter stretches of the Thames estuary, and it was found actually it was quite doable, easier than you would think. There was also a problem with the sea wall. You can see here there is a sea wall with a lip towards the top, and the problem was how to get tanks over the sea wall. Well, in France, they found the designer of the sea wall in Belgium, and he supplied the plans, and they built a replica near Calais. And they devised a way of getting tanks over the lip. And you can see here a kind of portable framework which the tanks used to get up over the lip. This, you can see, there are really connections with the Normandy here, but there is no kind of doctrinal continuity link. But you can see the beginnings of Hobart's funnies here, and how useful would that framework have been for tanks to get it over the seawall on Sword Beach on that first high tide after the invasion. So people who say that British amphibiosity made no progress in the First World War after Gallipoli are not really telling the truth. But the reason they can say it is because Hush didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Because the army got started on the Third Battle of Ypres and ended up getting bogged down in Passchendaele. And so the thing had to be cancelled. But Ramsay will have known all about this. Had the plan taken place, his little gunboat would have been right in the forefront, doing close-range beach bombardment and fire support. Now, in October 1917, he was suddenly taken out of that ship and given the most famous destroyer in the world, over the heads of many other destroyer officers. And the reason was that HMS Brooke, named after Philip Brooke of the War of 1812, but the ship was always pronounced Broke, so I will call her Broke. HMS Brooke had become really famous under her previous CO, Edward Evans. Edward Evans had been Robert Falcon Scott's second in command in that fatal last Antarctic expedition. And he was a man of immense physical strength who ran his ship by a kind of personality force field with a slight hint of physical menace. And he turned his grumbling, work-shy British matlows into berserkers. And he would have the upper deck stashed with axes and rifles with bayonets and cudgels in case they were boarded. And he said, I'm going to board an enemy ship. He didn't actually, but the axes and cudgels came in useful. Edward Evans fought a famous battle in the Dover Straits in April 1917, in which 2 British destroyers, Broke and Swift, encountered in the middle of the night 5 Germans and routed them, sinking 2 of them. It involved Broke actually ramming one and in the end rolling over her, and a lot of Germans, desperately trying to save their lives, clambered over her anchor and cables onto Broke's forecastle, trying to save their own lives. At this, the word boarders went around the ship, and stokers streamed up from below and grabbed the axes and cudgels and disposed of the Germans in a bloody, slippery mess. One officer is said to have had his throat cut by the ship's cook with a galley knife. This was what Edward Evans could do, but the ship was a shambles. He didn't bother with administration. He was a bit like me. If you opened a cupboard, you might well be swamped by unanswered letters. There was no systematic discipline, and it was basically simply run as a kind of really aggressive, really bullish anarchy, in a sense. These 2 officers then, Ramsay and Edward Evans, are a very interesting case study in alternative, but both very effective forms of leadership. The problem was, why did this happen? Why was Evans rumbled at last after he was a national hero, promoted to captain for the Goodwin Sands battle I've just described? Well, I think, joining up the dots, he had to take to sea in September The first Sea Lord, John Jellicoe, a stickler for discipline and spit and polish and doing things properly. Vice Admiral Dover Patrol, Reginald Bacon. The American Admiral Benson and his Chief of Staff, Commander Ernest J. King. And it's my suspicion, I'm really filling in the gaps here, that Jellicoe or someone on his staff, ferreting around between decks, uncovered horrors and took Bacon aside and said, look, you've got to get this ship sorted out. Get Evans ashore and get your most disciplinarian, best man in to fix it. And I think that's how Ramsay ended up in this ship. It was a very difficult command. Because the men had become national heroes, they were used to free-range kind of running riot. They frequently ran riot in the pubs of Dover, where no doubt they were easily bought drinks and perhaps got other benefits for the sake of having been in HMS Brogue. Very difficult for Ramsay to come in and impose discipline on a ship like that. Now, he produced a 3-page list of the things wrong with the ship. It's a horrific list. They all refer to cleanliness, efficiency, record keeping, confidential books, signals logs, and so on. It's a complete shambles. Incoming COs often exaggerate the state of the ships they're inheriting. But even allowing for exaggeration, this is a searing indictment of the way Evans ran his ship in the official Pusser sense of the word. It was hard work. Key to it was his first lieutenant. He had inherited Edward Evans's first lieutenant, who had the splendid name of Maximilian Despard. But he only lasted 3 weeks, and you can see how, given the first lieutenant's responsibility for every aspect of a ship's efficiency, you can see how it would have been very difficult for Despard to adapt to Ramsay's methods and admit that basically it had all been wrong up till now. He then got another first lieutenant called Noel Beaver. He was a kind of king's hard bargain. He didn't last very long either. A novelist could not ascribe to Lieutenant Beaver his predilections. He had a sex obsession, and he spent a lot of time in naval hospitals on account of VD of various sorts, which cannot have escaped galley rumor in HMS Brogue. So Ramsay had to get rid of him, and he got rid of him after 3 months, and then finally got his third first lieutenant, a man called Mike McMaster, who was efficient and met his standards. Now, once again, he was back in Dunkirk, often in charge of a division of 4 ships, 2 of them French. And his job overnight when he was a duty division was to be at anchor in Dunkirk roads with their anchors fixed to slip rather than to weigh, and with steam up, waiting to go charging out northeastwards in case of a German attack, and going through the Zuidkut Pass. This is vital. This is really interesting. Brogue had a draft of 11 feet. There's a confidential Admiralty chart that the nice people in Taunton will produce for you, which says that it marked 1916, and it says Zuidkut Pass is believed to have shoaled to 2 fathoms. Well, if you consider that a ship moving at 20 knots, which was in Ramsay's standing orders, going through the Zuidkut Pass at night and taking all that navigational risk, she would have squatted at speed, and she would certainly have suffered condenseritis even if she hadn't run aground. It's navigation, it's very interesting. Navigation wasn't Ramsay's strong point, but he was not a risk taker, and I find that quite an interesting arrangement. He never actually had to do it, but one of his sister ships did on the night of the big German spring offensive on March 20th, 21st, 1918. Both had to go through the pass and actually rammed a German torpedo boat. Something really happened, nasty for Ramsay, difficult for Ramsay, happened at the end of 1917. Jellicoe was sacked, and with him his boys lost their jobs. Reginald Bacon went ashore. He'd been thought responsible, or rather in denial, about the number of U-boats running through the Dover barrage. And the man sent to replace him was a friend of Jellicoe's replacement, Rosie Weems. That man was Roger Keyes. So Roger Keyes was sent to replace Bacon in the Dover patrol. And he brought with him his own favourite henchman, Captain Wilfred Tompkinson, to take over the destroyers, the 6th Destroyer Flotilla. Tompkinson became Captain D to the 6th Flotilla. Not long after, it's like Operation Hush, that Keyes had his own kind of ripping plan for 1918, and it was to block the 2 canals that led to the inland port of Bruges, which was a German naval base. And obviously, famous was the Zeebrugge raid. Ramsay was not there because Broke was in refit at the time, and he was actually salmon fishing in North Wales. But when he read the press, he was really annoyed at having missed it. He felt that opportunities were evading him. He was there, though, and the second attack on Ostend on the 9th, 10th of May, when he was one of the offshore destroyers. There were 8 offshore destroyers, and Ramsay was in charge of 4 of them. He wasn't the senior destroyer officer. And the thing passed off reasonably successfully. A bit like Zeebrugge, it wasn't quite a success, but it looked good. He wasn't involved in the mayhem of violence at the harbour mouth. He was there to provide protection against German interference and a bit of shore bombardment from 3 miles offshore. He later told his wife, Margaret, that Keyes had blocked him from a DSO after Ostend 2. That's actually not supportable. All the 8 destroyer captains got the same acknowledgement that Ramsay did, and mentioned in dispatches, and none of them got a DSO. It's very hard to see what that was based on. But that kind of added to a sort of grievance against Keyes, which began to develop, particularly because of the submarine incident. Ramsay tried to ram a British submarine at the last day of June 1918. It wasn't his fault. The submarine shouldn't have been there. It failed to answer his challenges, and in the end, he just had to go in and try to ram it. He bent a periscope and dropped a couple of depth charges. And when it was all sorted out and the submarine had limped back into Dover, it was clear that the whole thing was a ghastly mistake. Keyes held an inquiry in which he blamed Ramsay. It wasn't his fault, as I've said. It was Keyes's fault because his staff had failed to notify a change of time of leaving harbour of the submarine. Keyes held an inquiry which blamed Ramsay. Ramsay was very bitter about this. And after a few weeks, a rejoinder came from the Admiralty, from an assistant secretary, Mr. Vincent Badley, Vinbad the sailor, who wrote reversing Keyes's verdict and saying, no, this is the staff's fault. This is not Ramsay's fault. I don't believe Keyes was selecting Ramsay just deliberately to give him a hard time. I think he just couldn't admit a mistake on his part. But the thing sank into Ramsay's head that he was being hunted and discriminated against by Keyes, and also by Tompkinson by now. He had several rows with Tompkinson. Ramsay liked to make helpful suggestions, which after a while ceased to be welcome. One particular row was about boiler cleaning. He had sent in a memo saying that we're wasting too much time with boiler cleaning and we could do it in much, much shorter time. And Tompkinson had a blazing row with him, which clearly the thing wasn't handled terribly well. And this sort of added the grist to the sense that he was being victimized by his bosses. He felt they were waiting to have me at every turn, which of course is pretty unlikely, since of the 30-something destroyers of the Dover Patrol, Broke was one of the most valuable assets, and why would they, in a sense, have a go at a very efficient captain? Then there was a hospital ship collision just before the armistice. Escorting a hospital ship, the Princess Elizabeth, a Belgian government-owned shipping company's cross-channel packet handed over to the Admiralty for the war, they came into contact. It wasn't much of a collision. It bent a guardrail or something like that. But there had to be an inquiry. And the inquiry, Keyes blamed Ramsay. Now, I can construct a reason why Keyes might have done that. He had been courted by the Belgian royal family ever since Zeebrugge. and he starting his lifelong rapport with the King of the Belgians. And clearly, if the Belgian master of the Princess Elizabeth had been blamed for this collision, it would have caused more dissonance than if Ramsay was blamed. So we don't know the details of it. It's impossible to work it out, the rights and wrongs of it. But nonetheless, this time, Vinbad didn't come to his rescue, and so it remained on his record. And he resented that. It offended his amour propre. He years later, said to Eisenhower that every good naval officer has a blot on his record or two, and this is probably what he's referring to. He got the verdict on the night of November the 11th, after getting back to port and hearing about the armistice. And so while people were maffecking in the streets of Dover and corks were popping in patrol wardrooms, Ramsay was in his cabin writing a letter to Tompkinson, a rejoinder. And Tompkinson wrote back in these terms here, a letter which Ramsay said was a really nasty letter. Well, it isn't really. It's actually a senior officer trying to stop one of his subordinates getting into deeper trouble than he already was in. Then he was selected to take the king over to France. Certainly a privilege, partly because of the size of HMS Broke, huge ship, very comfortable officers' quarters. The captain's cabin had a chandelier in it. And because it was built originally for Chilean Navy, South American requirements, therefore, terrible quarters for everybody else. He was selected to take the king over to visit his victorious army. And his immediate response was to go over to James Morton's ship and get some paint out of him. He got a lot of paint from his friend, plus several sailors to help pipe the side party to pipe the boatswain's calls when the king went ashore. He took the king to Boulogne. It was a difficult maneuver into Boulogne harbour. It went off very well indeed. Nothing went wrong. And in this picture, that might be Ramsay up on the top right, don't know. And on the way back, after the return journey, a couple of weeks later, the king gave him an MVO, made him a member of the Royal Victorian Order, which is a kind of small courtier, not trinket, that's very rude, but it's sort of given for personal services of a non-warlike nature to the king. And one or two people in the Dover Patrol already had them for various things. It's possible that Roger Keyes had selected HMS Broke to do this because he guessed the king would give him an MVO. And this was a kind of way of making amends, but I doubt it. After this episode, he then went to Tompkinson to put in a request for the paint that he'd borrowed from James Morton. Tompkinson said no. So he had the problem of how to pay back Morton all this paint, and again, adding grist to the mill. Finally, I should say, I'm very nearly there. There was a punishment warrants thing. All this is revealing about Ramsay, the commander. But he sentenced a man to jail for leave breaking. We don't know the length of time for. The steps were 21 days, 42 days, 60 days. The punishment warrant that went up to Tompkinson, because it was beyond Ramsay's summary powers, was returned to him by Tompkinson saying, reduce this man's sentence to 21 days. Ramsay said, well, I might reduce it to 42 days. Tompkinson was furious, as Ramsay would have been in his position. He was the flotilla captain. It was his job to equalize punishment standards across his flotilla, and really Ramsay was out of order in challenging flotilla policy. So he was sent up to Keyes' chief of staff, Algernon Boyle, for an interview without coffee, and then up to Keyes again. And all this added to the idea that he was sort of being victimized. So in 1918, at the end of the war, what about Ramsay? Well, he had an extraordinarily difficult task of bringing this shambolic but famous ship up to standards, which he had done. It was highly efficient by the end of the war. He was the captain of a famous destroyer, but he was not a famous destroyer captain. Opportunities had dodged him. there was the inequity of medals. He wasn't a medal hunter, but he might have supposed that they had been avoiding him, perhaps since 1904 in Somaliland. Many of his friends and fellow COs had DSOs. Victor Campbell had 2. Andrew Cunningham had 2. Charles Lightoller of the Titanic RNR had 2 DSCs. And Ramsay possibly felt that this is maybe why he later blamed Keyes. So what were his prospects? He was still third equal out of his 33 original midshipmen's class out of Britannia. The 2 senior to him, one of them had the VC, 2 were equal to him, 9 had disappeared off the Navy list, and all the rest were junior to him. But he kind of felt he wasn't on golden roller skates. He hadn't had the real chances. He'd never quite been at the right place at the right time, unlike, for example, Cunningham, who always was. It wasn't his fault. It was just, in that sense, luck. Tompkinson finally reported on him. A zealous CO, has his ship in very good order, but I do not consider him tactful or to possess good judgment. Vice Admiral Keyes concurs and says he's a keen sportsman, which to Keyes was very, very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That was marvellous, very entertaining, very interesting. Our third speaker is General Julian Thompson, who has had 2 distinct careers. He joined the Royal Marines in 1962, serving in the Indonesian confrontation in Europe, Northern Ireland. He commanded 40 Commando in 1975 and then commanded 3 Commando Brigade in 1981, including, of course, the Falklands War, where he was the initial Land Forces commander. He retired from the Royal Marines in 1986 and set out on a second career as an author and historian. Having been both a graduate and an instructor at the Staff College, he was awarded a Leverhulme grant when he left the forces and carried out research at King's London in the War Studies Department into logistics. And this was published in 1991 as The Lifeblood of War, Logistics in Armed Conflict. He's now a visiting professor at the War Studies Department at King's and has published many volumes, including at least, I think, 4 with the Imperial War Museum. For the purposes of today's symposium, the most relevant is Dunkirk, Retreat to Victory, published in 2008. And today he's going to talk about, I can try and get this right, he's going to talk about the wider military significance of Dunkirk. Julie.
After Dunkirk, George VI wrote to his mother, "Personally, I feel happier now we have no allies to be polite to and to pamper." Well, I doubt if those directing Britain's wartime strategy would have agreed with him for reasons that I'll return to in a minute. Now, I've been asked to speak on the wider military significance of Dunkirk, and I take this to mean the military significance of the fall of France and successful evacuation of the BEF, which I think leads into the second half of the symposium. It's a pretty large subject, so it's going to be a bit of a gallop. I'm going to cover it under 5 headings: the effect of the course of the war, the effect on British strategy for the war, the effect on the maritime war, the effect on the air war, and the effect on the amphibious scene. Well, I believe that had the BEF not been saved at Dunkirk, that the British would have sought some accommodation with Hitler. As this was what he wanted, I think he would have probably gone along with it. I won't speculate about what form it would have taken. I submit that because Britain fought on, this allowed time for the Americans to get used to the idea they might have to become involved in this war. The final catalyst, of course, was the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941. But the USA, whose army in 1939 ranked 17th in the world after Romania, was even as late as November 1942, in the words of Field Marshal Sir John Dill, more unready for war than it is possible to imagine. It's therefore, I contend, inconceivable that America could have played any part in stopping the expansion of the two Axis partners had Britain given in when France fell, or made a separate peace with Hitler in 1941, as the late Alan Clark was so fond of suggesting. Without Britain and her empire and Commonwealth continuing to resist after the fall of France, Hitler perhaps might have won the war. What was the effect on British strategy? Well, with the fall of France, British strategy for fighting the war lay in ruins. For years, the British had shied away from committing an army onto the continent of Europe, and when they finally did so in February 1939, as late as February 1939, it was on the assumption that the next war would mirror the last. In the opening years, the French would halt and contain the German army. This would allow the British army to build up sufficiently in manpower to enable it to play a full part in what would be a replay of 1914-18. And despite time being allowed in the 9 months of the phony war, this time was not foreseen, of course, or catered for. This was still insufficient to manufacture the necessary equipment and raise an army into the size of the 56 divisions that had fought with the BEF in the First World War on the Western Front. It's also conceivable that the defeat of the French army in 1940, which led to the withdrawal of the British army from the continent, was a blessing in disguise for the British, although not for the reason that George VI gave in the letter that he wrote to his mother. It certainly would not have been seen as a godsend at the time. Indeed, for reasons I'll cover in a minute, the fall of France was to make the British conduct of the war infinitely more difficult than envisaged by the chiefs of staff and politicians in 1939 and early 1940. But there were bonuses as well. First, because in 1940, the German offensive in Flanders and France was not halted, and there was no 1940s version of the Western Front, including the massive casualties. Just over a year later, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and it was on the Eastern Front that the main body of the German army was engaged for 4 years. It was here that the colossal losses suffered by the French and British in the previous war were repeated, only on a vastly increased scale, but borne this time by Russia. Thus, Britain, because of the fall of France, was granted some time out, respite from engaging the German army. And indeed, the British army never again engaged the German army, the main body of the German army, on land for the rest of the war. There was tough fighting in several campaigns, yes, but not against the main body of the German army. That was engaged in Russia. The debit side of the reckoning after Dunkirk and defeat of France included a number of unpalatable realities. The first being that the French army of 94 divisions, was out of the equation, leaving a handful of badly equipped British and Commonwealth and Empire divisions to face some 160 German ones. Granted, these would not be immediately encountered in Europe, and in Britain only if the Germans invaded. But until Russia came into the war, those German divisions were a potential threat to British interests in the Mediterranean and conceivably in the Middle East. Indeed, even when embroiled in Russia, the German army could still spare sufficient formations to cause the British considerable grief in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Greece, and the Aegean over the ensuing years. What was the effect on the maritime scene? Well, in 1917, the U-boats nearly brought the United Kingdom to its knees when they had only a short stretch of the Belgian coast and Germany's North Sea coast from which to operate, and access to the Atlantic routes involved a long trip round the north of Scotland or through the bottleneck of the Straits of Dover. Now, from occupied France's Biscay coast, the U-boats could sortie straight out to attack shipping in both the North and South Atlantic. The occupation of Norway gave them an added bonus, of course, because it gave them bases from which Condor aircraft could sortie out and spy on and attack convoys as far as southern Greenland. The fall of France also drastically altered the strategic balance in other ways. The Royal Navy had counted on the well-equipped French Navy to cover the Mediterranean, while it protected trade routes and fulfilled imperial commitments elsewhere. Now, the French Navy was immobilized in French ports by the terms of the Armistice Treaty with Germany. At the same time, Italy had come into the war on the German side, bringing with her a powerful battle fleet and a large air force. And although the latter was equipped with obsolescent types of aircraft, the numerous bases in Italy and Sicily enabled the Italian Air Force and, of course, later the Luftwaffe to pose a major threat to shipping transiting the Mediterranean. Long after the Italian surface threat had been severely reduced by the Royal Navy, the air threat in the Mediterranean led the British to lengthen the voyage from UK to Suez from 3,000 miles to 13,000 miles round the Cape of Good Hope, and to India from 6,000 to 11,000 miles. What about the effect on the air war? Well, with bases in Holland, Belgium, and France, the Luftwaffe could now reach every city in the United Kingdom and turn the illusion with which British politicians had frightened themselves and the citizens of UK since the mid-1930s into reality. I use the word illusion because till mid-June 1940, the phrase, "the bomber will always get through," was just that, an illusion. Baldwin, who is credited with the phrase, was wrong, as the RAF discovered in the early months of the war when they attempted daylight raids on Germany from Britain without fighter escorts, although it took a couple of months for the penny to drop. For example, in the Wilhelmshaven raid of the 18th of December 1939, they had a 50% loss. Most German aircraft in 1940 and for most of the war were designed for tactical support of ground forces, not for strategic bombing. They had a small radius of action or combat radius, especially in the case of their fighters. Flying from bases in Germany, the Luftwaffe simply did not have the capability to mount attacks on cities and communication links in the UK. And if they'd attempted it in daylight without fighter escorts, the bombers would have been easy meat for the RAF. After the fall of France, it was very different. From airfields in northern France to London, the combat radius is 240 miles. Not only could the Luftwaffe attack the UK, they could also attack shipping in the Channel and the North Sea, while the Condors could range far out into the Atlantic as eyes for the U-boats and also able to attack with bombs and machine guns. Between June and November 1940, Condors operating from Bordeaux sank 90,000 tons of Allied shipping, and for the next 3 years, in Churchill's words, they were the scourge of the Atlantic. What about the effect on the amphibious scene? Amphibious operations, and I would say this, wouldn't I, are reckoned to be the most difficult of warfighting pastimes. And Dunkirk was, if you like, an amphibious operation in reverse, and as such, at the most demanding end of the scale of difficulty, because in this case, it combined an amphibious operation with a withdrawal in the face of the enemy, in itself a most hazardous undertaking. It was fortunate, therefore, that a flag officer of the quality of Ramsay was in charge, and you've heard how expert he became on that part of the world. And of course, he was to become, in my view, the practitioner par excellence of the amphibious art. Others are going to be covering those aspects, so I will not. But in 1940, the British had a very long way to go in learning or relearning the art of amphibious operations. Why? The Committee of Imperial Defence, the CID, formulated defence policy for consideration by the Cabinet and prepared the necessary plans in the event of war, and combined operations, as they called it then, which we now call joint operations, involving land, sea, and air, and including amphibious operations, did not figure in any plans in the interwar period. As late as 1938, the First Sea Lord told the Chiefs of Staff Committee that he, quote, did not foresee a combined operation, joint operation in our terminology, being mounted in the next war. The CIGS also said there were no plans for landing a force in the face of strong opposition. Curiously, despite this lack of interest in high places, combined operations were regularly studied and exercised in the 3 service staff colleges. In addition, an Inter-Service Training and Development Centre, the ISTDC, was set up rather late in the day in 1938, its task to study and develop the tactics and equipment needed for combined operations. At the outbreak of war in 1939, the ISTDC was closed, and its Naval and Air Force members were posted away. Fortunately, the Army member remained and was able to assist in the reopening of the centre when, with the fall of France in 1940, it was suddenly realized that we might have to use such skills. Because now, the British Army, having been ejected from the continent of Europe, the only way back had to be through a series of amphibious operations. And it was to take a considerable amount of time and effort to progress from the low state of expertise in which all three services had started the war to the first great amphibious operation, North Africa, 2 years later, in which, of course, as you know, Admiral Ramsay played a leading role. So the Dunkirk operation, the removal of the greater part of the BEF for France, shortly followed by a second BEF evacuation from Cherbourg, totally changed the strategic picture in the four areas I briefly covered. It forced the British to think about amphibious matters seriously for the first time since 1918, and brought into prominence the man who I think of as one of the greatest amphibious commanders and planners in our history, Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay. I'm going to end on a quote from him when he spoke on the subject. "Service in combined operations is, unhappily, still regarded by many of the best naval officers as a sideshow. And if they are temporarily in it, their one desire is to get back to normal sea service at the earliest possible moment. This is a most undesirable state of affairs, for circumstances demand the presence in this kind of operation the best officers and men we have got, and we cannot afford always to be changing them and to be conducting operations with inexperienced personnel." And when we hear later from Commodore Michael Clapp, you might agree that Ramsay's words were apposite in 1982 as they were when he spoke them in 1942. Thank you.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for all three of our speakers for most stimulating talks. Now, the floor is yours. Please remember to use the microphone, which will come round to you. And if you could give us your name when you speak, that would be very helpful. Please. Who's going to?
You've got some up there.
Over there.
It's on.
Mr. Chairman, Michael Simpson, Swansea University. I was interested to hear Corelli Barnett say that Ramsay thought that Rear Admiral Kirk of the United States Navy was not quite up to his job. I have to say that in a letter to Rear Admiral Edwards, that is Ernest King's Chief of Staff, on the 17th of January 1944, Kirk did say that his relations with Ramsay were entirely satisfactory. On the other hand, Cunningham, in his diary, says that Ramsay certainly had a way of working the Americans up and creating bad relations with them. So there are two sides to that particular coin. Thank you.
Across the other side of the gangway.
Major Laughlin, Mr. Chairman. We had various references this afternoon to Scotland and Scots, but I wonder whether the panel would care to comment, following the brilliant success of Dynamo, on the sad failure to rescue the 51st Highland Division from St. Valery-en-Caux in June 1940.
The 51st Highland Division was in a very difficult position because they were detached to the French right at the beginning of the campaign, and found themselves cut off from the rest of the BEF, retreating with the French army when the German army crossed the Somme. And they ended up in a pocket. And the problem there was that the commander of the division was absolutely determined that he was not going to cut and run and be seen to be retreating and running away, and therefore give a bad example to his French allies. And then what happened was that the place chosen to withdraw them from was dominated by German armour on each side of it, and the Navy had a huge problem getting in there because of visibility problems. And I think it was just, I have to say, bad luck in that sense. I don't think there was any sense that they were being abandoned or being cast to the enemy because planning wasn't made. I think every effort was made to withdraw, but it just went wrong. That's my view on it.
I can't add any useful knowledge to the answer, but just as a sort of curiosity, at the time of Dunkirk, my mother was handing out buns in Aberdeen railway station, and a train came in full of utterly catatonically exhausted soldiers, and she watched them being prized out of their carriages and loaded onto lorries, and they were taken to the Gordon Highlanders' Donside barracks, which of course were vacant because its rightful tenants were at St. Valery. And there they were bathed and fed and put to bed for 2 days and then sent on leave. I've always been annoyed that my mother didn't take a note of the livery of the railway carriages. Were they Southern Region anyway, that's another issue.
Could I just suggest that one answer to you is that is in sheer geography. I mean, Dunkirk and even the closer Belgian North French campaign was well within fighter command's cover. If you look at the map, the south of the Loire operation, you cannot cover it. You could not cover it, and therefore it seems to me that only a timely evacuation would have been possible. Now, if of course the commander of the 51st Highland Division, who probably was an ancestor of Alex Salmond, insisted on staying put, then he was a bloody fool. And you know, within the circumstances, the only thing to do was to evacuate in time.
One other point I would make to you on St. Valery is that on the day that the Royal Navy were due to arrive, there was very, very heavy fog, and that caused all sorts of problems. If you go and look at St. Valery and go there, you look at the heights on the cliffs on either side of the harbour, it's a very, very narrow harbour entrance. They would have been very, very pushed to get many people off at all.
Perhaps you can tell us, because I can't remember, what was the actual transit distance between St. Valery and British southern British ports as compared with Dunkirk and southern British
It's considerably long. It's much, much longer, isn't it? It's
about 3 times.
About 3 times, yes, certainly.
Okay.
Further question? Yes, sir, down in front.
Sorry, thank you. Adrian Crisp, Churchill College. On a related subject, how about the evacuation from Calais, where 3 battalions of 1 territorial and 2 regular excellent battalions could have been taken off? And I think I'm right in saying that Ramsay was prepared to do it, but was under orders that he must not, at the particular orders of Churchill, that they must stay and fight for to appease the French. Could you please comment on that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that they were ordered to remain. And of course there's a huge bitterness about that afterwards, not surprising. I think they could have been taken out, they could have been withdrawn, because one of the features of the way the German army fought, and many people that I know who fought the German army, which doesn't include me, of course, comment on their lack of wish of pushing at night. They didn't like fighting at night particularly, and therefore everything tended to close down, and they could have taken them off at night, I think, had there been the will to do it. But there was no evacuation plan. Or there was a plan, but it wasn't put into effect. And I actually believe it was because Churchill didn't want to be seen to be letting down the French.
I think, it's worth making the point that Boulogne, they did get them off. The Guards Brigade at Boulogne were taken off. And it's interesting that the Secretary of State for War at the time, Anthony Eden, was a Green Jacket, and they were Green Jacket troops at Calais, and he was very much aware that it was his old regiments that were going to go into the bag, and that certainly added an extra tension to his passing on the orders from Churchill. I'm pretty certain it was Churchill's orders that they were to stay there and to fight it out.
I think one has to make allowances for the fact that this was a campaign that was being very rapidly lost. The situation was changing all the time, and it was always changing for the worst. And already by that time, the whole chance of the Northern Army Group, including the BEF, being totally surrounded and destroyed was very lively. And Calais and Boulogne obviously were part of what would have held off a southern prong of the German armoured forces, which would otherwise have snaked round to the Channel ports and completed the cutting off of the BEF. So I think there was a reason why these last stands were made, not just out of futility, but actually in order to make possible an evacuation of the whole force, not just a few.
Down the front.
Harry Belsey, University of Third Age. I saw an American program on TV the other week about Enigma. And they claimed that we had broken the Luftwaffe code in early 1940. And we had detected a high-up fight between Goering and the German army about who was going to finish off the BEF at Dunkirk. Goering won. So they held the German army back. And the thrust of this programme was that Goering tried to get rid of the British army there, but of course did not succeed. But it gave us a window and information on German intentions to then plan the evacuation of Dunkirk. Now, I don't know whether this is true or an American fabrication, but that's what they said.
What we need here is an intelligence expert, which I am certainly not.
I'm not an intelligence expert, but I would say a number of perhaps slightly adjacent things. That Goering, as I understand it, promised he would close down the port of Dunkirk.
Yes.
And that's what he did. He just wasn't banking on the mole being used and the beaches. In a sense, he did what he said, what he said on the tin. But he failed to stop the BEF leaving. I also don't believe this. You haven't quite raised this, but the idea that Hitler stopped to let the British get away, I think this is total tosh. The German tank commanders have been living on crystal meth for about 3 weeks by now. They were exhausted. The country around Dunkirk is not tank country. It's got canals and ditches. It's a tank trap. And the Germans probably, remember in the First World War, they'd twice been frustrated at the Battle of the Marne from getting to Paris. And I'm quite sure to them the BEF was a sideshow that could be sorted out later, given that Goering was going to close down the port. And I'm quite sure that their eyes were on Paris and not on Dunkirk at that time, because of the experiences of 1914 and 1918.
I absolutely agree with what Andrew said. And in fact, the German armoured commanders were, as far as they were concerned, Dunkirk was not their bag. They wanted to turn south and engage the French army. They didn't want to be done out of victory as they had in 1914, and that was totally on their mind. Hitler did not actually stop the attack. It was suggested by the German army commanders that they should refurbish their armour and start turning it 90 degrees in a different direction. And they liked to blame Hitler because he's a convenient scapegoat. I mean, there are many occasions when Hitler did screw it up later in the war by his personal intervention, but I don't think this was one of them.
Well, I'm sure the German General Staff thought that the really big battle for France was still to come, and it was going to come between where they were at the time of Dunkirk and Paris, and therefore they didn't want to see their strength in any way dissipated. They wanted to hold their armoured forces together in time for what they thought was a decisive battle still to come.
Okay, we have a question down here.
One down here.
One down there.
Andrew Gordon, I think, raised an interesting point about the colour of the railway carriages. I think they probably were green, and of course the operation of getting 300,000 exhausted men away from the Channel ports was indeed a subject in its own right, which it would be interesting to hear more of at some other time, no doubt.
Well, I think the point is that nothing like that had ever been done before, so nobody could expect... I mean, if those circumstances arose now, we'd say, well, we can do it because of Dunkirk. But it had never been done before.
I think you're quite wrong. I think we couldn't do it now.
Well, probably right.
They didn't have privatised railways in 1940, so they... yes, they did. Didn't have much. Up there, sir, yes.
Richard Miller. I understand that at a fairly early stage in the Dunkirk operation, Churchill issued a directive relating to the ratio of British to French soldiers who were to be rescued from the beaches, possibly with the intention of keeping the French in the battle and avoiding the impression that the British were just leaving. Did this impinge upon the conduct of Dynamo, and if so, in what way?
He said that equal numbers of British and French troops were to be evacuated, and that is more or less what happened to begin with. But you have to remember that the French eventually, of course, were left with fighting the last of the rearguard action, and went on fighting for another 24 hours after the last British troops were evacuated. And so they were left holding the ring. A lot of French soldiers were brought off by British ships and by French ships. And many of them, of course, then ended up back in France again through Cherbourg. Yeah. The majority of them ended back in France through Cherbourg.
Phil, you want to add anything? No. Okay.
Got a question over here?
Nicholas.
Nicholas Roger. I wonder if I might make a few small points which arise from things people have said. First of all, the point about reading German Enigma traffic. It's correct that in 1940 they were already making small breakthroughs into Luftwaffe signals traffic, but limited amounts of information from Luftwaffe tactical signals was not going to say anything whatever about strategic intentions discussed at the highest level around a table in Berlin. So valuable though it was, it has nothing to do with this sort of debate. And I think it's absolutely clear from a million sources that what everybody has said is quite correct, that the German eyes were elsewhere. We also to stress that the German army had a very small armoured and motorised element, but the vast bulk of the German army marched on foot, and its supplies followed on horse-drawn wagons or by train. The armoured had long outpaced their infantry and everything else. They were in a very exposed position if the French had managed to get a serious counterattack together, and they'd almost totally run out of petrol. So they had every possible reason for stopping, which had nothing whatever to do with the British. In fact, they couldn't have carried on attacking, even if they had thought it prudent to do so. A second point, the points were made about geography in connection with Saint-Valery, which is absolutely correct. I think it's worth stressing more than people have the very odd geography around Dunkirk. If you want to evacuate people, you need a port. Ships need ports, ports need ships, and if you want to evacuate a large number of people, any old port won't do. You need a port which is designed to take large amounts of passenger traffic, and you need ships which are designed to carry it. Basically, you need a channel port and channel steamers. And Dunkirk just about qualified because it was a small railway port, one of the smallest, in fact. The problem was that it was obvious to the planners that the port was almost certain to be knocked out within a few hours. I think there were 3 berths in Dunkirk, if I remember correctly. The likelihood was that a ship would be sunk in the narrow entrance almost immediately by bombing or shelling, and the port would be out of action. So the planning assumption was that they would have to take everybody off the beaches. You take people off beaches, you're talking about a very slow business with ships' boats. And the beach along there, Bray Dunes, has almost the shallowest gradient of any place in the whole of Europe, which means to say that a ship the draft of a destroyer couldn't get within half a mile of the shore. So a very, very slow business bringing off trickles of men in ships' boats is what you're talking about. That's why the assumption was such a very small number of people. And that's also why they go to this effort to round up motorboats. The public imagines that what they thought they were going to do, indeed the public imagines that what they actually did do, was to carry hundreds of thousands of men across the channel in motorboats. But this was, of course, an impossible idea and never the plan. The plan was to get the boats across the channel and use them to supplement ships' boats to ferry people off the beaches and then to abandon them. There was no idea of their returning. And in fact, that is what they did do to a limited extent. But what changed everything, as we were told, what changed everything was that the moles survived, though the berths were blocked, and the moles allowed ships, mostly cross-channel ferries, which actually took the great bulk of people, to take huge numbers of people off the port. The beaches never got more than a few tens of thousands of people away. It was the moles at Dunkirk and survival of the moles which made the whole operation possible. And there was no reasonable reason to expect that that would have happened. That really was extraordinary luck.
Thank you, Nicholas. I would emphasize that. And anybody who's seen the I think, 1953 film with John Mills entitled Dunkirk gets a very good impression of how they were going to use the small boats and of what it was like on the beaches. Anybody else? Any other queries, points to raise? Yeah, Alan, we're just about on 50.
No, well, I have to congratulate you, Chairman. That's superb timing.
The only thing I got right, thank you.
Can I thank you, and can I thank all of our panellists, Andrew, Julian, and Bill. And we adjourn now for half an hour, and we will get back. We want people back in here at about 5:02, so that, again, we can start as promptly as possible. Thank you all very much. Coffee is in the buttery. Thank you.